Our closing speaker, who's actually on the fly, we're going to have him join the panel as well because he wants to get in on the action once we start asking questions, is Tim Frisbee from the Shared Use Mobility Center. He has a long and distinguished career in the public relations sector and also in politics, and he is going to talk about what the Shared Mobility Use Center is doing, actually putting these ideas into action. And we're glad he came from out of town to join us. So I want to thank you, Tim, and let's give a big round of applause for Tim Frisbee. Thank you for coming.
Thank you, Matt. Thanks, everyone. So I know what people are going to have questions, so I'll try and keep this relatively quick. But I just figured I'd kind of bookend all the great stuff we heard today with kind of a back out and do a little bit of a bigger picture overview of shared mobility, where we're at and where we're headed across the nation. So the Shared Use Mobility Center is a public interest partnership. We're a nonprofit based in Chicago, focused on fostering collaboration in shared mobility and extending the benefits for all. And we like to say that our mission at the end of the day is to make it possible to live well without needing to own a car, which of course New Yorkers have actually been doing for quite a long time, but the rest of the nation is not there yet. So we do that in a number of ways. We connect public and private sectors with communities. We conduct research, create tools for cities. We work on pilots, so we're working with the city of Los Angeles to put electric car sharing into low-income neighborhoods in LA. And in Chicago, we're working with a company called Get Around to study peer-to-peer car sharing in low-density and low-income neighborhoods. And finally, we do a lot of convening. So, just like the great conference here today, we really try and bring folks together to keep the discussion going, talk about some of the challenges we're facing, and how we might overcome them. We heard a lot of great stuff today. We heard about the importance of equity in taxis and TNCs, which continues to be a big issue for the industry. We've heard about the importance of sharing, especially when you think about autonomous vehicles and the shared versus owned models, land use and parking, the curb space, the power of demand and of aggregating that demand, and our relationship to our cars, which is changing in a lot of ways. So when we talk about shared mobility, we're talking about all these things, right? First and foremost, public transit, but bike sharing, car sharing, ride sourcing, which is a term we use for Uber and Lyft, ride splitting, which is that Uber Pool, Lyft Line product, shuttles, traditional carpooling, microtransit like Via, taxis, very important in New York City, and mobility hubs. So here's just a quick snapshot of shared mobility in North America. So we joke that every time we use this slide, we've got to update it because something is out of date. As everyone knows, this industry is changing so fast that at times it's really quite overwhelming. But especially in the last year, it just seems like we're really having this groundswell of momentum in terms of powering urban mobility forward. So just a quick snapshot. In 2016, 15 million Americans will have used this year Uber or Lyft. We've got over 100 US cities now have bike sharing systems. And that includes station-based bike sharing, like here in New York City or in Chicago, where I'm from. But there's also some new models. There's free-floating smart bike systems, like in Portland. Places, Baltimore and Seattle and other cities are experimenting with e-bikes and electric bike sharing. Someone had a question earlier about ADA accessible bike sharing, and there is a company called Zagster that's working on putting trikes and side-by-side tandems and some of those bikes for people with other mobility needs into systems. We've got mobility on demand partnerships are exploding. The federal government really stepped in this year and has started to kind of try to play a role in what's happening here. So we had the Smart Cities Challenge. We had the FTA Mobility on Demand Sandbox. Those 11 projects were just announced. So it's really exciting to see them come in and start to be more involved here. And even more so, that I find exciting is the local level. There's really a groundswell of support for transit and for sustainable transportation. So on election day, we had many local ballot initiatives pass to fund some of this stuff in cities like LA and Seattle. But as has been mentioned today, we're not there yet. Right? So transportation has become the #1 source of carbon pollution in the US, so more than electric utilities, more than residential, more than commercial sectors. Almost half of Americans still lack access to public transportation. You hear people occasionally talk about captive transit riders, right? People who ride a bus or ride a train as a mode of last resort. Well, there's a lot of captive drivers in this nation, right? There's the people who are inching to and from work every day on crowded freeways. These are people who don't have a better option. We also have issues with job accessibility. It's been touched on today, all the parking. 3 parking spots for every 1 car currently in the nation. So the good news is we have more tools now than ever before to change this. But I guess what I would just try and impart on everyone today is that we can't just sit back and wait to see what happens. And this has kind of been said as well, but we really need to be proactive about planning the cities that we want. Do we want density or do we want sprawl? Because some of these modes could lead to sprawl. Do we want a transportation paradigm that emphasizes cars, whether they're autonomous or owned, or do we want to emphasize transit, biking, and walking and those types of modes? So we're at this critical inflection point, which I think Rohit called the 4th revolution, and now it's our opportunity to reshape our cities. And just to put that in context, here's a quote that I think is pretty compelling. This is from Christiana Figueres, who oversees the UN's work on climate change. So the infrastructure we build over the next 4 years will determine the fate of humankind. So I think that's pretty dramatic, and I think that speaks to everyone in this room in terms of the issues that we're working on, that they're very important and very timely. So we think shared mobility plays a huge role in this, right? So shared mobility can be implemented quickly. It can help connect jobs and housing, serve non-work trips, it fills gaps in the weekend, and it can help with overcrowding on transit, and really helps to complement public transit. One of the main questions about as these new modes have proliferated is, where are these people coming from? If you're taking someone out of a car from behind the wheel and putting them in a shared Uber or in a bike share bike, it's probably a good thing from our perspective. If you're taking them off of a bus or off of a train and you're putting them into a backseat of an Uber, it's maybe not as good of a thing. So we actually did a study this year for the American Public Transportation Association based on just on this issue. And so we interviewed transit agencies in 7 cities. We did a survey of 4,500 shared mobility users, and we looked at some kind of scraped Uber and transit trip data just to see how they were comparing with one another. And that what we found at the end of the day is that the people who use shared modes, the more they do it, the more likely they are to use transit, own fewer cars, and spend less on transportation overall. And within that group, there was a subgroup that we called the super sharers. So these are people who use multiple forms of shared mobility across all trip types. So commuting, social, errands. And we found that these guys actually had the greatest transportation savings of all, and they owned half as many cars as people who use transit alone. And I think that's pretty significant because you figure transit riders are already a relatively car-light population. But this just speaks to how all of these modes work together to create a robust ecosystem of options that allow people to live car-free and car-light lifestyles. You can't just have car sharing, you can't just have ride sourcing or bike sharing. You need everything kind of working together. We also looked specifically at Uber and Lyft and transit, and what we found is that actually the highest demand for for TNCs is between 10 p.m. and 4 a.m. So times in most cities where transit's running infrequently or maybe not available at all. And then on the flip side, we saw the biggest peaks in terms of GTFS demand for transit were in the morning and evening rush hours. So again, it's showing these modes kind of complementing one another. So at the end of the day, to mix my metaphors a little bit, we consider transit as the backbone, right? That kind of supports all these other modes. And once you get shared mobility and transit working together, you can really start to get at some of these big issues, right? Poverty, access to jobs, climate change, addressing civil rights, but only if they work for everyone. So you have to. This is something where we try and get involved, and this is why the public sector is so important in this industry, is because you have to make sure that this works for everyone. So if it's not for everyone, it's not for us, is a great saying I've heard some people use. But low-income communities, elderly residents, people with disabilities, rural areas. We can't just hop into self-driving cars and head for the sunset. And leave these people behind. They've got to come with us. Some of this stuff is happening, which is good news, and I'll just run through a couple of the latest developments in the industry. One is the uptick of we call them grassroots ride-hailing services. So these are kind of spin-off TNC models. Liberty is one. It's launching this month in rural Nebraska, and this is kind of an Uber for rural areas, helping to serve people. If you can imagine, if you live in a community like that, if you don't have a car, you can't drive, you're isolated. You need to be able to get to the doctor, to the grocery store. So it's really targeted at that population. We saw this year also the first nonprofit TNC launch, which is Ride Austin. Someone mentioned Juno earlier, which is kind of an interesting model here in New York City. So it's been interesting to track that. Also for seniors, we're seeing more. So there's TNCs for senior citizens, mostly in California, but Silver Ride, Lyft Hero, and these are companies that use trained medical professionals as drivers. So these are people who are nurses, medical students, who are driving in their off hours. We've also seen a really big uptick this year in terms of partnerships with Uber and Lyft and with National MedTrans Network and large senior residential facilities, and helping subsidize Uber rides, in some cases subsidize smartphones so they can hail an Uber. And then going beyond that, in Pinellas County, Florida, you can now hail an Uber via phone. Okay, Lyft has a concierge service that helps allows third parties to hail a ride for someone who doesn't have a smartphone or maybe isn't tech savvy. Paratransit is something that was discussed earlier, but looking at VIA, I think you mentioned it. But how do we use some of this new technology? Paratransit is critical, but it's very expensive for transit agencies, and it doesn't always work well for the users. So how can we kind of help move that along? Automakers and shared mobility. It's been an explosion of everyone hopping into the space this year. Just a couple final notes. Integrated fare payment is a big one. LA was able to at least partially integrate bike share into their tap card. And in Chicago, we just got a grant to integrate Divvy into our transit system. So that's the idea of using one card or one app to be able to pay for an Uber, pay for a bike share bike, pay for your train ride, and just making those connections more seamless and encouraging that multimodal lifestyle that we want to see. Also mobility hubs, that's what this is an image of, but kind of the physical manifestation of that super share concept. So bringing together bike share bikes, car share cars, pick up drop off for TNCs, transit, and again, just enabling those connections. But at the end of the day, and I think Rohit acknowledges as well, it's not about the technology, it's not about the vehicles, it's really about the people. And if we can keep that in mind, I think at the end of the day we'll be in good shape. So, thank you.
Okay, thank you. Do we have any questions for the panel? If so, come up to the microphone. If not, I have a question. It's not about the love car. There was
I don't know anything
interest
about that. I just heard it anecdotally.
We, if everybody could give their input real quickly on where they think consolidations or where it's going to end up. I know Daniel didn't take a specific oh, we did? Okay, good. Okay, we'll save that one for last. Well, let's go with your question first.
Hi all, thank you for a very interesting discussion, and I was hoping you could comment on today's news that BMW is launching a luxury car share in Brooklyn, and how you think that introduction of the concept of status in shared mobility will affect the rollout of these programs.
Well, we already have the, Uber, Lyft have, or Uber at least has an offer, Uber Select and the black car, so we've seen that already a little bit. And I guess my initial reaction is that it's positive. I mean, if it's bringing people in to shared mobility who otherwise wouldn't be using it, I think it's a good thing. So at the end of the day, from my perspective, it's all about options. So having that as an option, I think is a positive. And we've seen Mercedes-Benz come out with a peer-to-peer car sharing, as well as some other brands. So I think that's something we'll continue to see more of.
If you're taking your better half to the opera, why not? It doesn't have to be that you sign up for it in perpetuity, but maybe you can get it for the evening.
Yeah, Zipcar have been using BMWs and Volvo as part of their fleet for a while now, and I think with great success.
I was especially curious how it would impact your kind of development scenario. If a certain development has some yucky cars that are on call, how will that play in?
It would work, but not in a 60-unit development.
Yeah.
You would need a 500-unit or 1,000-unit development where you have a fleet of shared cars, maybe 10 or 12. Then you will have 2 luxury cars, 2 minivans,
Right.
2 mini cars, and an assortment of cars to provide choices.
Right, yeah, different cars for different purposes. If you're going to take a long distance trip to Washington, you might want a much higher speed autonomous vehicle than that little tiny runabout that you use in town. So,
And bicycles too.
and bicycles too.
Next speaker.
Yes, hi, good afternoon. My name is Placida Robinson, and I'm the president of the Independent Medallion Owner Driver Association, which is responsible for the voice of the independent medallion owners, New York City taxi owners here, that provides public transportation for the citizens of New York. I think I stepped out for a minute, but I came back in and I saw that the first presentation had a slide up. It looked like it was triaging curbside space. And I'd like the speaker for that presentation to kind of explain a little bit. I'd like the speaker for that presentation to explain a little bit about how that curbside space, what the plans are, or the thinking is behind triaging that curbside space.
That was Rit's presentation. Unfortunately, he's not here. Rit, are you in the room? Alas, no. I guess we can't network with Sidewalk Labs.
Does anybody want to address the curbside situation?
Well, one of the things that I brought up in my presentation, when we eventually get to no drivers around, the car drops you off in front of your house and drives away with nobody in it, and goes to an actual staging area, which may be an automated parking garage off the street, all of a sudden, curbside is wide open. Nobody's actually parking on the curbside. And in fact, that gives us the opportunity to maybe look at our residential streets and say, hey, maybe we don't even let anybody down the street anymore. We close the street off, make it a park, make it a playground, make it some other kind of utilization. Because if you want to get in and you live on this block here, get dropped off on the avenue and walk in.
Actually, you know, Andre, maybe you could comment on that also. How is this affecting VIA right now?
Yeah, and I just wanted to make this comment before you do, is that did you consider the fact that especially yellow taxi cabs, you know, the reason why we're in existence is because we have the exclusive right to street hail. And dependent upon that exclusive right is our ability to pick up and drop off. Really, I think the motor vehicle regulation is within a certain amount of feet from the curb for legal pickup and drop off. So as we move further and further down the road to envisioning a new mobility and new vehicles and autonomy, I want to know what thought is being given to the existing stakeholders who provide a regulated transportation public service that requires that we are able to provide that service. And when the presentations think about street hail and curbside, and when I saw that slide up, and any of you can talk about that, where do we get a chance to be a part of that mix and fulfill our obligations to pick up and drop off? Are we just being eviscerated out of the picture? That's the only thing I'd like you to think about. And we're not autonomous yet. But before we get there, you know, with all of the bus lanes in New York City and all of the other planning, it seems like we've been planned out of our regulatory obligation and our service that we want to provide, which is pick up and drop off exclusive street hail. Where will the customer hail us if we're not curbside? That's all I would like to ask you. Thank you.
Who wants to hit that
I
one?
think part of your answer is in the complete street concept. That is something that's being implemented nationwide. Many of the states, many of the communities are implementing that concept where the streets are for everyone. And as we evolve, that complete street concept will be changing to accommodate transportation as it is changing.
This challenge that you're putting forward to us is actually already present right now, and it doesn't even require no one to be in the car, and it's a fully autonomous car. Right now, people are hailing using their phone, standing anywhere they feel like standing, and the vehicle does show up, and you know it's yours because you just got a tweet or just something, a message on your phone that this is your car. So yes, well, it would be ideal to be able to walk, and again, just like you know, Mary Tyler Moore, anybody know this story? You know, put your hand out and get a vehicle like that. That may become anachronistic, unfortunately. Or maybe still is existing, but you know, a larger question really, I think, within all this is to what extent are jobs actually unequivocally obliged to exist in an environment where no one needs to be actually in the vehicle.
I would just add and say that I agree with that there's more pressure on curb space now for cities than there ever has been before with the influx of all these new modes. And it's an issue for cities. And I just popped into my mind as the example in San Francisco. They have a major problem with all the tech shuttles there, right? Because you have all these people who are commuting to Silicon Valley, and they had an issue with all these Google buses and other companies, pulling in, using public bus stops, using curb space, obstructing traffic.
Yep.
And what they did
There were
was
practically riots about that.
yeah, and it kind of it's not resolved, yet. But what they did is they started a pilot where they decided to track it, regulate it, and charge a fee. And it got I don't know what, $2 per stop event or something like that. And it helped to by regulating it, bringing it into the fold, they were able to track it and to turn a little bit of a profit on it. So I think that kind of speaks to the city's role is that by making more formal street space policies, I mean, you can, by giving up something to these companies, you can get something back in return.
Well, I just wanted to
typical,
add, though, that we
what?
have paid our regulatory price. It's not anachronistic. We paid $1 million per medallion to pick up those fares.
Okay, you've had 3 questions. Now, Andre wanted to say something.
Sorry, no, I just wanted to make one point, which is an element that within how VIA works, it's a little bit different from the other companies. You said, that when you hit on your phone and you hail a car, it comes right to you, and that actually is not how we work. You have to walk, as I think I mentioned, a block or two to a very specific corner, and you get dropped off often at a very specific corner that's a block or two from where you're going. And those corners are partly, which is the most efficient way for the cars that we have on the road to pick you up, but it also, the corners are picked out as being places that are good for pickups and drop-offs in a way that allows us to continue to be efficient without interrupting traffic and causing a lot of problems. So that's actually something
Do you get your own signs up yet?
What's that?
When do you get your own signs?
Our own signs.
Well, in other words, this is the corner, if you want to via, you now know that you're actually staying in the right spot, or does your phone basically tell you got to stand here?
They need to adopt the West Coast model where, like, when Google had their buses, now it's a revenue source for the SFMTA, which is an interesting possibility, right? That somebody may approach you and say, and they're doing it at the airports now with Uber and Lyft. In fact, if you go to certain airports, in Phoenix, I was just back from there, they have an Uber zone, like an Uber pickup area, and they paid for that. So I don't know if that's something that's you're encountering, but also, is it really an issue for VIA as well? Do you have built into your algorithm and the app itself the ability to pick up in legal spaces only? Or is that something that's kind of worked out between the passenger and the driver?
No, so nothing is worked out between the passenger and the driver. Okay, so when you order a VIA, you are then told to walk to a very specific corner. It often says stand at the corner, like the northwest corner of 79 in Amsterdam in front of X shop. Like that's usually the typical thing that you get. And that's all been we figured out ahead of time that we're not gonna have our vehicle stop at corners that they're not allowed to stop at. That's all been predetermined, okay? Well, you mentioned with the airports, right? That's like a whole, airports across the country are figuring out different ways to regulate and charge fees, and there's lots of different models and options there. But I don't know if that's what you were asking.
Well, you have a
And
small...
then our cars are have an emblem on them that say VIA.
Right, sure, but you have a subset of corners in Manhattan that basically you've identified are good corners, and you regularly use them for your routes. So that anybody actually wants something, they're going to go to they're not going to go to random corners. They're going to go to corners that you've actually pre-sorted and pre-figured out route-wise and most efficient for your system.
When you request the VIA, you get a message back that says, there's a car 3 minutes away, it can pick you up at this specific corner. Do you want this seat in this car? And you can say no if it's too far away or you don't, it's too long a wait.
Right.
So before you are charged and before you accept the ride, you know where you're going and where you're going to be picked up. And then where you get dropped off is a dynamic thing that can actually change. Like while you're in the vehicle, the drop-off location can actually change.
Oh, okay.
Okay, let's put another question into the hat.
Hi, shared mobility question. I work in the city, and that's just me, but in terms of the suburbs, I know you've talked a little bit about mall and they're very congested, but in terms of shared mobility for companies with limited parking or no parking, where there's basically more employees and spaces, Is there any experience, I don't know if there's an experience with Google that can explain where shared mobility has actually helped and addressed either congestion and improved the lives of employees who obviously instead of, if they're going to a mall and they're driving around in a circle trying to find parking, we have that with my particular company. So I'm curious of experiences where shared mobility is currently in place or potentially down the line you could see could be addressed.
I'll just.
Well,
Go ahead.
Sorry.
Go ahead. Thank you. In New Jersey, we have organizations called TMAs,
Okay.
Transportation Management Organizations, and they help employers in that regard. So if you're a large employer, you can reach out to them, and they'll provide you with a program for car sharing and carpooling. I hope that answers your question. Other than that, if it's in a shopping center environment, that's a planning issue, and that's why we're going now to mixed-use developments and moving away from the segregated land uses, such as the malls, that are really vehicle intense.
Yeah,
Tim?
Our situation is just really simple that our growth of employees has outstripped what we have for spaces. And our employees use company vehicles, so those company vehicles are stored on the property. So in addition to your company vehicles, you have personal vehicles, and now we're just, we're out of space.
Are you in Morristown by any chance?
I work for Metro North.
Okay.
Okay. So is it possible that you actually could park your employees elsewhere and then shuttle them in? Is that an option for you?
It's a number of different options are looked at, but yes, that could potentially be done. I don't know if that's an optimal solution. Again, it's culture shock for some of the employees to have to deal with that, and because of shift times as well.
I'll just add two things onto that. One is that there are companies that are trying to get into that on-demand carpooling space, specifically with employers. So there's a company called Split, SPLT. It's based out of Detroit that I know is working on that. But they're basically trying to use some of this technology to make it easier to combine rides and to encourage carpooling, within companies. The other thing is that some of these, Lyft I know has actually an enterprise solutions branch, which I never really knew about until earlier this year. But they actually work with they work with Apple and some big employers, and they do things like offer Lyft credits, so you might offer employees a set number of credits every month. I didn't actually really touch on this, but they do a lot of first last mile stuff, so they could actually geofence certain areas, certain transit stops, and saying if you use Lyft to or from this area, we'll pick up half the cost or we'll cover it. So I know those are two things going on, but yeah, TDM programs play, or traditional would have played a big role, and some of the cities where we've seen shared mobility catch on, have had strong TDM programs in place, and I think that that's helped.
Okay. Time for one last question before we
Thank you, Matt.
go to our reception.
Point codes again. It seems to me that what all of you, except for the gentleman from New Jersey with the housing input, you are all talking about systems that have optimized the use of free and unpaid for public assets in the form of ground, roads on top of ground, air space and air shed above ground, and potentially the water that has to absorb all the eventual outputs from mobility that involves fossil fuels and the other material. So one of the reasons you get a lot of pushback from the taxi people is because taxi pricing and market systems are designed to have payments embedded in them to cover the cost of operating those public assets for the sake of mobility. So they fix the potholes, or they control emissions, or whatever. So what I'm after is how long do you think you're going to be able to have this market model that lets you keep having the roads and the air shed and the airspace and all of those things for free? And what are you going to do when your pricing model has to change? And sort of as a subset of that, are you looking at electric vehicles so that at least there's some expectation of minimized use, at least of the air shed, and particularly, and this is where your model comes in, are we installing the electric infrastructure along the way? Are any of you operating systems that are going to contribute to the recapitalization required for this to continue operating, or are we just going to keep sort of living off what exists?
Okay. Who wants to take that one?
Well, I think I addressed a couple of these issues in what I was talking about, in as much as there's going to be a cost to use this thing, obviously, and there is no reason that the providers of these services should not be paying, whether it's fuel taxes or whether it is usage taxes, because I think eventually, as we get to greener cars, whether they're autonomous or not, we're no longer paying for gasoline because we're not going to use that anymore in the long run. We may be using natural gas, maybe paying carbon taxes. We may be paying carbon taxes for electricity that's generated by fossil fuels. But whatever the particular case, I definitely would see that there's some kind of fee, cost, payment structure, recycling dollars essentially back into the entity that is going to manage the actual physical assets. Now, it seems in today's paradigm, we have DOTs doing the decision-making for it and utilizing revenues that are essentially allocated by legislatures, et cetera, to do that. But it may be in the future that these organizations actually would rather work with other independent companies to actually develop, maintain, take care of the infrastructure, and to deal with some of the externalities that you're talking about.
Are the people in those companies doing that?
This is all, what I'm speaking of is the future.
Yeah.
There's nobody actually doing any of that right now. Today, I'm not aware that Uber or Lyft or any of these companies are essentially, paying dollars, charges, fees, gas taxes, etc., as part of their model. They're pushing that down to the actual operators themselves.
Yes. Andre?
Yeah, no, I mean, I would just say there was a lot that's wrapped up into your comment and question, obviously, right? You're touching on a lot of different issues, but both here and in Washington, D.C. and Chicago, which are the 3 states we operate in, we're fully complying with all of the current regulations. And it's not, the premise of your question sort of sounded like it's a totally unregulated area, and it's not. Obviously, we're paying taxes, we're paying...
I don't think of it as regulation, by the way. I'm one of those sad little Republicans. I believe it's market. It's market. Pay. If you use it, pay for it. I think it's a function of market interrelationships. Now, if we need to call it regulation because that's the only method we think works, okay. But I rather think of it as just getting the equities right in the transactions. And if you're using something, you should pay for it. And if the answer is I'm not going to pay for it until somebody makes me, then okay, yeah, I guess we need regulation.
No, I would say a couple things. First, we are paying, taxes. I don't know, and I'm not sure what you mean by we're not paying for it. I don't exactly understand.
Well, not all the systems are the same. I understand.
Okay, yeah. But the second thing is, I think I don't know if you were here and saw the graph on sort of our level of efficiency compared with some of the other services. We are actually routinely getting 4, 5, 6 people into these cars as they take a trip, and so I think we are actually helping on the greenhouse gas front, right? And that is something we care about as a company. And then third, I would say we want to actively partner with cities and work with them on better transit solutions. And so I think part of what our sort of customer facing model, which we have in New York, Chicago, and DC, right, that requires a lot of density to be able to charge the low flat fares. There's only a certain number of places in America and in the world where that can work, right? But we think that our technology has tremendous value beyond those places. We want to work with cities on improving their transit and sort of help them be part of the solution to these challenges that we have with the high cost of infrastructure and various other things. So those are just a couple of points.
Well, unfortunately, we are out of time and about to be evicted, but this has been a great discussion. I will say, maybe the next panel that we have, now that Maureen has said she's a Republican, we'll do a vote sharing panel next year, which could be a possibility. You could pick maybe one of your order of 10 candidates, and then the computer can match it up. Hopefully, that's part of the future plan. But in 30 seconds or less, maybe just one last question, which I was trying to ask before. There was a slide up there that Daniel had, and I think you had it too as well, Tim, about all these different companies out there, automobile manufacturers, vehicle leasing companies, car sharing companies, ride sourcing companies. Does anybody want to be bold enough on the panel to predict what you think is going to be left standing?
Prognosticating beyond saying that.
It's true, though. Google has sort of pulled back a little bit and said, no, we're not necessarily going to lead and run a service. You've got other firms that basically, they're just sort of getting new into this space. Ford says it's really interested and wants to build cars, but is it really in a position to actually provide? I mean, it's a rather huge IT lift to be able to sort all these kinds of applications that are going to deliver your car whenever you need it, and stage and store them.
I think we're going to really, not to plug our next gig, but on December 8th and 9th at Tandon School of Engineering in Brooklyn at Metro Tech.
Great school, I went there.
We haven't, so you better be there then. We're going to have an autonomous vehicle symposium, which I think the autonomous vehicle piece is we'll continue the discussion there, but that's driving a lot of this too, because the more I hear about what's happening in car sharing and vehicle rental and leasing is merging together, but then in order for autonomous vehicles to really be used on the roads outside of platooning freight and buses, we're talking about possibly the government or private industry being given a franchise where the entire, every car on the road becomes autonomous, and then there's some control exerted. And what happens to taxis? What happens to vias? There's that concern. And is Uber going to become an automobile manufacturer, or are they just going to sell their patent rights to an automobile manufacturer that hasn't developed as good of a model as they come up with that from all the engineers that they've coached, the robotics team? These are the big issues that I think are on our mind, and nobody wants to predict. Are we going to have Uber manufacturing cars? Are we going to have Ford doing Uber? Or is Google going to just do everything? I mean, does anybody?
I can't pick a winner, but I would just say that what has been the question is who's going to own autonomous vehicles? Is it going to be San Francisco or is it going to be Detroit? And I think it's starting to look like it's not an either or. That, I mean, we're going to end up with partnerships. You know, you're seeing GM invest in Lyft and Uber, and a lot of stuff along that line. So I think you'll probably end up with kind of both those industries as part of it.
Okay, that's an answer for sure.
There seems to be a certain degree of getting together and teaming up, but quite frankly, it's almost there's this larger marketing and delivery aspect, which is really what Uber is about. That's really almost the dominant thing in this thing. The cars are secondary. Uber can just pick up the phone and say, I need 100,000 cars. And next thing you know, you've got a city just flooded with cars that are essentially providing the service that they want to provide.
Well, I'll end on this note. One of the first things that Mayor Bloomberg said to me when he asked why taxis have a certain limited number and why they have an exclusive right to pick up street hails, he was trying to convince me, I think, that liveries can pick up street hails, which ultimately was done with my successor. In the outer boroughs, and he said people vote with their feet, and I said yeah, but there are other people who may disagree, right? And the big issue is, will people who vote or people who use these services be the ones that decide, as it has kind of happened with Uber, right? Are these the folks that are going to decide what our future is, or is it going to be government establishment people in a room, or is it going to be academics? I don't really know, but I think it could be hopefully all of us, and that's why we're all here today, right? We're getting all the minds together. It's been a great day. Unfortunately, we're getting the hook. So this concludes our 4th annual Technology Transportation Summit. It's been a great day. I want to thank all of our panelists, thank our audience, and of course UTSC, NYIT.